Imagine this instead. You are an unseen observer, nothing more than a whisper of a presence, pressed against the cold stone walls deep inside the Vatican's most private chambers. The air is heavy, almost unmoving, thickened not only by ceremonial incense, but by something far more unsettling, something that does not belong in a sanctuary. The year is 1501 AD. From the dim corners where candlelight fails to reach, you sense movement, murmurs, footsteps, a strange tension swelling behind velvet curtains and polished doors. The soft rustle of fabric brushes across the marble floors, followed by bursts of laughter so out of place that they seem to fracture the silence of halls once reserved for solemn prayer. Your pulse quickens. You don't yet understand what you're witnessing, but you know it should not be happening here. Because on this night, the Vatican will host an event so controversial, so deeply inappropriate for its setting, that later generations would struggle to believe it occurred at all. Outside, October winds carry the scent of roasting chestnuts through the courtyards, but inside Cesare Borgia's private apartments, those same chestnuts will become part of an evening that later chroniclers would describe only in guarded language, an evening that would echo through centuries of debate, scandal, and secrecy. 50 invited entertainers, influential guests, and high-ranking figures have gathered here for a lavish, unrestrained celebration, one that would be quietly recorded by a meticulous observer in a private diary. A diary, locked away in the Vatican archives for generations, hidden beneath layers of ritual and reverence, like a sealed confession the Church hoped the world would forget. Tonight, we open that forgotten page. Before we bring this unsettling chapter of history into the open, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden and often uncomfortable truths of the past, make sure to like the video and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's remarkable that we can dissect these long-buried stories together from every corner of the world. The man who would one day wear the papal crown and earn a reputation darker than any of his predecessors entered the world as Rodrigo de Borgia, born on January 1st, 1431, in the sun-baked Spanish town of Zátiva. His early life was shaped by dusty roads, provincial politics, and a family whose ambitions stretched far beyond the borders of Valencia. Rodrigo's destiny shifted the moment his uncle, Alfonso de Borgia, began rising through the church hierarchy. When Alfonso ascended to the papacy in 1455 as Pope Calixtus III, the doors of power swung wide open for his young nephew. At just 25 years old, Rodrigo was elevated to cardinal deacon, an appointment driven not by piety or theological brilliance, but by the entrenched culture of favoritism that dominated the medieval church. It was a system where influence functioned like currency, and Rodrigo was now holding a golden key to the Vatican. He arrived in Rome with an ambition that could be felt before it was spoken, sharp, unyielding, and entirely practical. Whatever the Eternal City offered, Rodrigo was determined to claim it. 15th century Rome was a paradox. By daylight, pilgrims filled its churches with whispered prayers and flickering candles. But once the sun fell behind the ancient ruins, the same narrow streets became stages for deals, indulgence, and vice. The papal court itself mirrored this duality. Holy authority on the surface, political maneuvering, and financial bargaining underneath. Salvation, influence, appointments, everything had a price, and Rodrigo de Borgia understood the rules better than most. Rodrigo's rise through the church was anything but spiritual. He accumulated wealth with a cold, calculating focus, less like a servant of God and more like a strategist quietly constructing an empire. Titles, lands, and lucrative church appointments were gathered piece by piece across Europe, each one strengthening the power he intended to wield. His lifestyle mirrored that ambition. Extravagant feasts, palatial estates, and a very public string of relationships that produced children with predictable frequency. Among these partners, the most influential was Vannozza dei Catane, a Roman noblewoman whose intelligence and poise allowed her to survive the ruthless world of Vatican politics. Between 1474 and 1482, she bore Rodrigo 4 children: Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Geoffrey, each of whom would grow into a central figure in the turbulent saga that would soon engulf Italy. To Rodrigo, these children were not merely family, they were assets, instruments, future alliances waiting to be arranged. Their identities served political purpose, and their futures were shaped by his strategic needs rather than any parental affection. Even before he wore the papal crown, Rodrigo's behavior drew criticism. In 1460, Pope Pius II reprimanded him in a sharply worded letter, condemning actions in Siena that had caused public outrage. But Rodrigo was unmoved. Regret had no place in his world. The only goal was ascension. Every other concern was expendable. That ambition culminated in the conclave of August 1492. The election was less a sacred ceremony and more a political marketplace operating behind sealed doors. In the Sistine Chapel, decades before Michelangelo's brush ever touched its ceiling, 23 cardinals convened to choose the next leader of Christendom. Instead of prayerful reflection, negotiations unfolded with startling boldness. Promises were traded, favors exchanged, and wealth quietly redistributed. Influence became currency, and the outcome was all but predetermined. Rodrigo Borgia emerged victorious, not through divine inspiration, but through a perfectly executed campaign of political maneuvering that reshaped the direction of the Church. When the final ballots were counted on August 11th, Rodrigo Borgia emerged as the new pontiff, taking the name Pope Alexander VI. His ascent was no mystery. His election was widely understood to have been secured through the practice of simony, the open exchange of favors, wealth, and influence for votes in the most sacred election on earth. Yet, in a twist only Renaissance Rome could produce, the people celebrated him. Romans had long grown familiar, almost comfortable, with the lavish Spanish cardinal. They expected a papacy filled with grandeur, energy, and spectacle. On the night of his election, bonfires lit the 7 hills, torchbearers crowded the ancient roads, and his coronation at St. Peter's was met with what chroniclers described as the most thunderous applause any pontiff had ever received. And for a brief moment, Alexander lived up to the hope. Rome, which had been spiraling into chaos with more than 200 murders in the months before his election, suddenly saw order restored. He reorganized the city into districts, appointed magistrates with real authority, and personally held weekly hearings where citizens could present grievances. Observers wrote, almost with surprise, that justice under Alexander was swift and effective. For a moment, it seemed as though the Church had chosen well. But power does not transform a man, it exposes him. Whatever hint of reform Alexander displayed was quickly overshadowed by a singular obsession: elevating his children. Juan was granted a Spanish dukedom and married into royal blood. Cesare, barely 18, with no devotion to religious life, was placed at the head of the Archbishopric of Valencia and later elevated to cardinal, positions that served political ambition far more than spiritual duty. Meanwhile, the papal apartments became the stage for a new style of court life, one where ceremony, indulgence, politics, and rumor blended into a single spectacle. Lavish dinners extended late into the night, and entertainment routinely crossed lines that would have shocked even seasoned Renaissance nobles. Adding to the stir was Alexander's new companion, Julia Farnese, whose beauty became the subject of both admiration and gossip. Known throughout Rome as Julia la Bella, she moved freely through Vatican corridors with an ease typically reserved for high-ranking churchmen, her presence blurring the boundaries between public decorum and private influence. Her presence within the Apostolic Palace became a constant reminder that Alexander VI no longer even attempted to hide how deeply personal desire had eclipsed spiritual duty. Every appearance she made in those marble corridors silently broadcast a truth the Vatican could not erase. But how do we know any of this? How do such private moments, sealed behind fortified doors, survive the centuries? Because one man, armed only with a quill, steady hands, and an unblinking sense of duty, recorded everything. His name was Johann Burchard. Born around 1450 in Alsace, Burchard was a scholar of canon law who climbed through church administration until he reached a position few ever held, Papal Master of Ceremonies. That title granted him unprecedented access. He stood close enough to the center of power to witness nearly everything, yet remained just peripheral enough that no one considered him a threat. Beginning in 1483, during the reign of Pope Sixtus IV, Burchard kept a journal he called the Liber Notarum, a precise, relentlessly detailed daily record. He wrote in the measured tone of a bureaucrat, never embellishing, never dramatizing. That cold neutrality is exactly what makes his account so unsettling. He described morally questionable behavior with the same calm detachment he used when documenting elaborate religious rituals. He did not write to entertain, he wrote to record. That is why his pages have survived as one of the most important and most uncomfortable windows into the inner workings of Renaissance papal life. Vatican archivists would later struggle with the implications of what he preserved. Burchard lived in a peculiar space within the hierarchy. He was not powerful enough to influence events, nor insignificant enough to be dismissed from them. He drifted silently through the Vatican's restricted chambers like a figure half seen in candlelight, present, unnoticed, and perfectly positioned to observe the truth. By the late 1490s, the Borgia family's notoriety had begun to spread far beyond Rome. Whispers grew louder across European courts. Much of the criticism centered on Alexander VI's eldest son, Juan, who had been granted the title of Duke of Gandia. Despite the prestige, Juan lacked the discipline, temperament, and leadership expected of high nobility. Rumors multiplied about his reckless behavior, questionable decisions, and a growing list of personal scandals. The golden heir of the Borgia dynasty was becoming a liability, one the Pope could not easily conceal from foreign ambassadors or the watchful eyes of rival Italian families. The events of June 14, 1497 marked a turning point in the Borgia story. Juan Borgia's lifeless body was pulled from the Tiber, his throat cut, his body stabbed repeatedly, and his fine clothing shredded beyond recognition. The brutality of the attack sent a shiver through Rome. Whispers rippled across the city. Had justice finally reached the Borgia household, or was this the result of long-simmering political hatreds? For Pope Alexander VI, the news shattered him. Witnesses claimed he retreated into isolation for 3 days, refusing rest or nourishment, overwhelmed by grief that made even hardened diplomats uneasy. The powerful ruler who had once dominated European politics now appeared fragile, consumed by unbearable loss. In this raw emotional state, Alexander suddenly announced the beginnings of a moral and administrative cleanup within the church. Plans were drafted to curb financial corruption, reduce extravagance in the papal court, and address long-standing abuses that critics had condemned for decades. For a brief moment, many wondered if personal tragedy had succeeded where public outrage had failed, but the momentum faded almost as quickly as it began. The reform proposals were quietly set aside, the Pope's mourning softened, and Rome soon returned to its familiar rhythm. And when Alexander finally emerged from his grief, his focus had shifted dramatically, toward the one child who remained both a source of pride and immense danger, Cesare Borgia. If Juan had been the Pope's favored son, Cesare was something entirely different. He was brilliant, ambitious, and feared. Accounts describe him as striking in appearance and terrifyingly capable, someone who could charm a crowd and intimidate a council within the same hour. Although initially steered into the church, Cesare's natural talents aligned far more with strategy, warfare, and political manipulation than with scripture. In 1498, he made an unprecedented move. He abandoned the rank of cardinal, an act virtually unheard of at the time, and stepped fully into the world of secular power. Italy's political map at the end of the 15th century was a patchwork of small, independent states, foreign pressures, and bitter rivalries. For a man like Cesare, this chaos was not an obstacle, it was an open door. France, under King Louis XII, needed papal approval for a delicate marital matter. At the same time, several Italian territories lacked strong leadership and were vulnerable to takeover. Pope Alexander VI saw opportunity in all of this. To him, the shifting landscape was a chance to build something unprecedented, a political dynasty centered around his surviving son. Forming alliances, even controversial ones with powerful foreign monarchs, was merely a step in constructing a future Borgia state carved directly out of the Italian peninsula. Cesare Borgia's rise across central Italy was not the result of chance. It was the product of meticulous strategy. Through a blend of military pressure, decisive political maneuvering, and alliances crafted with surgical precision, he pieced together a territorial power base that eclipsed that of many established Italian rulers. His efficiency and cold strategic brilliance impressed even his enemies, and later inspired Niccolò Machiavelli to use Cesare as the primary model for his political treatise, The Prince, a work that still shapes modern political theory. But maintaining such rapid expansion demanded an enormous flow of money, far more than the ordinary revenues of the Papal States could supply. To keep Cesare's campaigns funded, Pope Alexander VI began relying on increasingly aggressive financial policies. Positions within the Church, once considered sacred, became instruments of political fundraising. Indulgences, ecclesiastical offices, and even seats in the College of Cardinals were distributed in exchange for substantial payments. European noble families eagerly participated, seeing these purchases as investments in influence and prestige. Over the course of his papacy, Alexander appointed 47 new cardinals, each selection bringing a significant sum into the papal treasury and, in effect, fueling Cesare's expansion. As this system solidified, Rome no longer felt like a spiritual capital. It resembled a city controlled by its own ruling dynasty. Alexander acted as the dominant patriarch, while Cesare operated with all the authority and ruthlessness of an heir apparent shaping a future principality. In this environment, Lucrezia Borgia's life became deeply entangled with the family's political ambitions. Despite the attempts of later generations to portray her more sympathetically, the reality is that she was repeatedly drawn into marriage alliances designed purely to benefit the Borgia agenda. When political priorities changed, previous arrangements were swiftly undone. Her marriages were reorganized or dissolved, not on personal grounds, but as moves on a much larger chessboard. One of her husbands, Alfonso of Bisegli, died under violent and suspicious circumstances during a period when Cesare held enormous power, an event widely interpreted by contemporaries as politically motivated. Inside the Apostolic Palace, the atmosphere reflected the extremes of Borgia influence. The papal apartments became the setting for lavish gatherings that blurred the lines between political strategy sessions and extravagant social events. Alexander VI hosted elaborate dinners, dramatic performances, and musical evenings, attended by high-ranking clergy, foreign diplomats, and influential Roman elites. These occasions were far from casual entertainment. They served as covert arenas for negotiation, displays of authority, and subtle tests of loyalty within the tightly knit circle surrounding the Borgia regime. Cardinals who chose to attend the Pope's extravagant gatherings often found themselves entangled in a web from which there was no escape. Their presence at these events, no matter how ceremonial or passive, effectively tied their reputations to Alexander VI. This was not accidental. It was a calculated political strategy. By involving high-ranking church officials in his most questionable festivities, the Pope ensured their silence. To criticize him later would be to expose themselves. To resist participation was even more dangerous, as those who declined invitations were quietly identified as potential opponents, vulnerable to the same swift retaliation that had already eliminated several critics of the Borgia regime. By the autumn of 1501, the Borgias had reached the height of their influence and, simultaneously, the depth of their notoriety. Cesare Borgia's campaigns across the Romagna had been brutally effective, earning him reluctant respect from military strategists throughout Europe. Alexander VI, meanwhile, had survived the political turbulence of French invasions, territorial disputes, and the relentless feuding of Italy's noble houses. The Jubilee year of 1500 had only strengthened the family's position, drawing vast crowds of pilgrims to Rome. The influx of visitors poured extraordinary wealth into the Papal States, filling government coffers, revitalizing commerce, and, in some cases, fueling the less reputable sectors of the city. It was in this environment, one shaped by victory, immense financial gain, and a complete erosion of moral restraint, that Cesare Borgia orchestrated the event that would later be remembered as the Banquet of Chestnuts. The precise reason behind the gathering has eluded historians for centuries. Some believe it was meant to be a celebration of recent political success. Others suspect it was designed as a bold demonstration of absolute power within the Vatican walls. And still others argue it was simply the inevitable result of a court that had steadily abandoned traditional boundaries. The contemporary sources rarely agree on motive, but they do agree on one thing. Whatever occurred that evening was so astonishing that it would be discussed, debated, and condemned for generations. The date was October 31st, 1501, All Hallows' Eve, a night that, according to centuries-old tradition, marked the thinnest boundary between the sacred and the profane. Whether Cesare Borgia selected the date intentionally or by chance remains unknown, but the timing felt symbolic. On a night devoted to solemn reflection and the honoring of the dead, the Vatican was about to witness events that would erode what little remained of its spiritual dignity. Cesare's private apartments inside the Apostolic Palace had been lavishly adorned by the painter Pinturicchio during the more optimistic early years of Alexander VI's papacy. The walls were covered with vibrant frescoes, mythological heroes, biblical episodes, and majestic symbols of Christian authority. Their beauty made the setting all the more unsettling, for what unfolded in those rooms aligned with neither classical virtue nor Christian tradition. These chambers, designed to project refinement and holiness, would instead become the backdrop for one of the most controversial nights ever associated with the Borgia reign. The guest list itself revealed just how deeply corruption had embedded itself into the highest ranks of power. High-ranking church officials, who were expected to spend the evening in prayer and reflection, now mingled freely with influential Roman nobles, many of whom had long since traded their silence for political favors. Diplomatic envoys from across Europe were also present, perhaps hoping to gather intelligence about future papal intentions, or perhaps simply compelled by curiosity to witness how far the Borgias would push the boundaries of acceptable conduct. Whatever their motivations, the attendees represented a cross-section of Renaissance power: clergy, nobility, and foreign ambassadors, all present in one room, all willingly stepping into an atmosphere that would soon stain the historical record for centuries. But the true focal point of the evening, the detail that would later ignite centuries of controversy, was the presence of 50 hired performers, personally selected by Cesare Borgia. These were not street workers pulled from Rome's alleyways. They were trained entertainers, accustomed to navigating the delicate expectations of Renaissance courts. Their role required not only charm and elegance, but also absolute discretion in the company of Rome's most powerful men. Among those present that night was Johann Burchard, the Papal Master of Ceremonies. He was not there by choice. His formal responsibilities required him to remain available for any unexpected protocol matters, even during private gatherings. This duty placed him in the rare position of being both an insider and an outsider, standing close enough to observe everything, yet removed enough to analyze it with cold precision. Burchard would later document the night in his Liber Notarum, writing in spare, unembellished Latin. The diary contains no dramatic flourishes, no emotional commentary, just a rigid, chronological account. And it is precisely this dry, clinical tone that lends his testimony such unsettling weight. According to his record, the evening opened without any hint of what was to follow. Guests were served a lavish dinner in Cesare's private chambers, a feast of autumn dishes paired with aged wines from the papal cellars. Conversations drifted between politics, military campaigns, and artistic patronage, giving the elite in attendance an opportunity to display their wit and sophistication. But as the plates were cleared and the servants retreated, the atmosphere shifted sharply. What began as a formal banquet quietly transformed into something far more controversial, an event that would later become one of the most whispered episodes in papal history. The performers, 50 in total, were dressed in elaborate silks and velvets, their costumes chosen to project elegance and glamour rather than modesty. As musicians, sworn to secrecy, played in the background, the entertainers began a series of choreographed dances meant to impress the powerful guests. At first, the atmosphere still resembled a typical Renaissance court entertainment, though the undertone was unmistakably provocative. According to Burchard's restrained Latin account, the mood shifted steadily as the evening progressed. What began as a formal presentation gradually drifted into behavior far more suggestive than appropriate for the apostolic palace. Though Burchard avoided sensational language, he made clear that the boundary between performance and impropriety dissolved as the night wore on, and that no one present could reasonably pretend not to understand where the evening was heading. The most notorious moment of the night involved the chestnuts that later gave the event its infamous name. Servants moved the large candelabras from the banquet table down to the floor, arranging them in clusters that cast uneven patches of flickering light across the chamber. Chestnuts were scattered across the marble tiles between these glowing islands of illumination. The performers were then instructed to collect the chestnuts as part of a competitive game, an activity that, because of the dim lighting and the deliberate staging, took on a tone that made the observers shift uneasily. According to Burchard's stark notation, Pope Alexander VI watched this display from a raised seat prepared for him, with Cesare Borgia seated nearby. The presence of Lucrezia Borgia, also noted in the diary, has long puzzled historians. Whether she attended as a reluctant witness, a political accessory, or simply because her presence was expected at family gatherings, remains a subject of intense debate. What is clear is that her appearance added an even more unsettling layer to an already disturbing evening.
Lucrezia Borgia's presence at the gathering has bewildered historians for generations. Was she a participant in her family's spiraling corruption, or a young woman trapped in the suffocating machinery of Borgia politics? The records offer no definitive answer. What they do confirm, uneasily, is that she remained in the chamber as the evening descended into its most troubling chapter. That final phase, described with unsettling restraint in Burchard's diary, involved a series of competitive games arranged among the male guests. Though the Master of Ceremonies avoids graphic detail, his wording is clear enough. Guests were encouraged to take part in contests of behavior completely inappropriate for the sacred setting they occupied. Winning participants were rewarded with valuable gifts. Burchard's notes, clinical, unemotional, almost bureaucratic, are the only reason we know these events occurred at all. His account strips away centuries of Vatican mythology and exposes an uncomfortable truth. For the Borgia dynasty, the papacy had become less a spiritual office and more a tool, an extraordinarily profitable instrument in a ruthless struggle for dominance. This was not devotion, this was not governance, this was a dark rupture in the moral fabric of the Renaissance Church. The rewards offered that night were deceptively simple: embroidered tunics, fine leather footwear, small silver ornaments. In an era when every luxury item required painstaking artisan labor, these were objects of considerable value and symbols of the moral rot at the center of the evening. Most disturbing of all was the manner in which these competitions were conducted. Servants, bound by duty and fear, were ordered to keep count of each guest's performance, reducing private, personal conduct to a tally marked for entertainment, transforming human dignity into spectacle. Burchard, characteristically restrained, finishes his entry with a single chilling line. He notes only that the prizes were distributed accordingly. Burchard's unsettling account did not circulate through Renaissance Rome. It was locked away, immediately and deliberately, inside the Vatican's secret archives, where it remained buried for centuries. When Pope Leo XIII finally opened portions of those archives to scholars in the late 1800s, he reportedly voiced hesitation, concerned that Burchard's centuries-old notes could still cast a long, corrosive shadow over the legacy of Alexander VI. The very fact that such hesitation existed nearly 400 years later shows how deeply the scandal had burned itself into the historical conscience of the Church. The following morning, Rome appeared unchanged. Pilgrims arrived at St. Peter's, clergy carried on with daily routines. Life on the surface continued as though nothing extraordinary had taken place behind Vatican walls. But the truth did not remain contained. Whispers spread rapidly through Rome's informal network of guards, attendants, servants, and minor officials. Diplomats, some of whom had witnessed parts of the evening, sent carefully worded reports back to their courts. Correspondence, preserved in archives across Europe, reveals the shock of ambassadors who believed themselves too worldly to be surprised by papal behavior. Yet even they expressed disbelief at what had unfolded inside the apostolic palace. Representatives of secular courts, many accustomed to excess within their own royal households,
recorded their astonishment that such conduct had occurred in one of Christianity's most sacred spaces. The political consequences were swift. Reformers throughout Europe seized on the reports as undeniable proof that the Church's leadership had become dangerously compromised. Preachers such as Savonarola pointed to these accounts as justification for sweeping ecclesiastical reform. For the first time, serious voices began calling for a council that might go so far as to remove Alexander VI from the throne of St. Peter, a demand that would have been unthinkable only a few years earlier.
Yet Alexander's reaction to the spreading scandal was nothing short of startling. Rather than retreating or attempting genuine reform, he pushed forward with even greater determination. He funneled more resources into Cesare's military ambitions and tightened his grip on political alliances. It was as though the world's recognition of his moral collapse had freed him from maintaining even the faintest illusion of restraint. The banquet of chestnuts was not an isolated lapse in judgment. It was the inevitable grim endpoint of years of unchecked excess, an evening in which the spiritual authority of the papacy and the worldly ambitions of the Borgias collided with catastrophic clarity. And astonishingly, Cesare Borgia's rise did not falter. In the immediate aftermath, his influence expanded, proving that in the volatile landscape of Renaissance Italy, public outrage was powerless against the momentum of calculated ambition. Cesare's campaigns continued to draw reluctant admiration, especially from thinkers like Niccolò Machiavelli. Machiavelli, fascinated by Cesare's razor-sharp political instincts, would later use him as the living blueprint for his philosophical arguments, asserting that successful rulers could not allow traditional morality to limit their effectiveness. In his analysis, power belonged to those willing to make difficult, often brutal decisions. But triumph forged on unstable ground rarely endures. On August 18, 1503, Pope Alexander VI died unexpectedly. The official cause was recorded as malaria, an all-too-common danger in Rome's marshy climate. But the atmosphere surrounding his death was thick with unease. The suddenness of his decline, combined with the violence and intrigue that had marked his entire rule, immediately sparked whispers of poisoning. Whether those rumors carried truth or merely reflected the fear and distrust his reign had cultivated, they spread rapidly across Europe.
Alexander's death triggered an immediate and devastating collapse of the Borgia power structure. With the papacy no longer shielding him, Cesare's carefully constructed alliances disintegrated almost overnight. Stripped of influence and abandoned by former supporters, he spent his last years wandering the battlefields of Spain as a soldier for hire, a dramatic fall from the heights of political dominance. He died in 1507, far from Rome, his once towering ambitions dissolved into obscurity. Lucrezia's fate was kinder, though still overshadowed by the storm her family had created. She became the Duchess of Ferrara and managed to carve out a respected role in her adopted court. Yet the shadow of the Borgia legacy followed her for the rest of her life, coloring every perception and historical memory of her character. When the next pope, Julius II, ascended to the throne, he made his stance unmistakably clear. He refused to inhabit the Borgia apartments. The very rooms where the infamous banquet took place were seen as irreparably contaminated by scandal. Julius instead moved to the floor above and commissioned the young Raphael to transform those spaces with the frescoes that would later become icons of Renaissance art. This relocation was more than a change of scenery. It was a symbolic purification, an attempt to sever the church from the moral disasters of the previous reign. But reputations cannot be repaired with new paint and empty rooms. The spiritual and political damage inflicted during Alexander VI's papacy lingered long after his death. Interpretations of the banquet of chestnuts have shifted dramatically over the centuries, reflecting each era's values and prejudices. In the 19th century, Catholic historians often dismissed the entire account as exaggerated or forged, insisting that a credible witness could never have described such behavior without error or later distortion. Protestant historians, on the other hand, seized upon the narrative as powerful ammunition, proof that the institutional church had lost its moral compass long before the Reformation. For them, this scandal was not an isolated incident, but a vivid example supporting their broader critique of papal authority.
Modern historians, after comparing multiple independent sources, generally agree that Burchard's notes reflect the core reality of what took place, though they emphasize that these events must be understood within the morally fluid landscape of Renaissance Italy. Lavish gatherings, provocative performances, and shockingly permissive court culture were not unheard of among secular nobles of the era. What made this particular event so infamous was not the nature of the behavior itself, but the identity of its host, the man who occupied the highest spiritual office in the Catholic world. The setting of the event adds a final layer of almost theatrical irony. The rooms where the gathering unfolded, spaces masterfully decorated by Pinturicchio with vivid scenes from classical mythology and sacred Christian history, created a surreal contrast. Painted gods, ancient heroes, and revered saints looked down from the walls, silently witnessing conduct that would have stunned both pagan philosophers and medieval theologians. These chambers, known today as the Borgia apartments, were designed to serve dual purposes: grand public ceremonies and discreet private functions. In practice, they became a physical symbol of the widening gulf between the Church's official ideals and the brutal human realities playing out behind closed doors. It was here, in these frescoed halls, that the final and most indelible stain settled upon this dark chapter of history. Later archaeological and architectural examinations of these rooms unveiled subtle, unsettling details. The chambers were not simply luxurious, they were engineered with deliberate layers of insulation. The design effectively muted sound between adjoining rooms, ensuring that what occurred in one chamber could remain entirely concealed from those nearby. This was no accident of construction. It provided exactly the kind of privacy that allowed increasingly questionable behavior to unfold without interruption or scrutiny. This revelation reinforces what historians have come to understand. The environment was carefully shaped to protect the actions of those in power. It was a palace built not only for ceremony, but for secrecy. The very existence of Burchard's diary in the Vatican's secret archives raises unsettling questions about how the Church relates to its own past. For centuries, the manuscript remained locked away, accessible only to a handful of scholars with special papal approval. The decision to preserve the document with meticulous care while keeping it hidden reflects a paradox. The Church recognized its immense historical value, yet feared the scandal it contained. In protecting the record, they were also guarding their own shame. Independent sources ultimately validated Burchard's testimony. Diplomatic letters circulating through European courts describe papal festivities that routinely pushed the boundaries of propriety. Few matched Burchard's stark detail, but together, these accounts form a mosaic of moral decay that confirms the underlying truth of the banquet of chestnuts. The ripple effects were enormous. Alexander VI's conduct became a weapon in the hands of reformers. Critics like Martin Luther pointed directly to such episodes as proof that the Church had drifted far from its spiritual foundations. The Counter-Reformation, its strict disciplinary reforms, its seminaries, its renewed emphasis on clerical morality, was in many ways a direct response to the cultural and ethical collapse symbolized by Alexander's papacy. The opulent Baroque pageantry that followed attempted to reassert dignity and control, replacing the uncontrolled excess of the Borgia era with carefully orchestrated grandeur. The psychological toll on participants is more difficult to measure. For many of the courtesans, involvement was likely a harsh economic reality rather than moral choice. For church officials, attendance may have been a mixture of complicity and fear, an unspoken understanding that refusal could lead to professional ruin. Meanwhile, the broader population demonstrated a complex separation between faith and leadership. Despite their knowledge of Alexander's personal failings, pilgrims still traveled to Rome, masses continued, and the sacramental system endured. Popular Catholicism had learned to distinguish between the corruption of individual leaders and the sanctity of the institution. The banquet of chestnuts, then, is not just an isolated scandal. It marks a turning point in the evolution of Renaissance Italy, a moment when spiritual authority and political ambition collided with explosive consequences. Alexander VI behaved like a secular prince in an era when the papacy could no longer afford such contradictions. His reign forced later popes to decide whether they would pursue worldly magnificence or moral credibility.
a decision that shaped the Church for centuries. Looking back across 500 years, that candlelit night in 1501 stands as a dramatic symbol of humanity's eternal conflict between sacred ideals and worldly temptation. The chestnuts scattered across the Vatican's marble floors became, unintentionally, a reminder of how far dignity can fall when power slips free of restraint. Today, the rooms where these events unfolded are visited by tourists. Their walls adorned with priceless art. The candles are gone, and those who witnessed the night lie long buried. Yet Burchard's precise Latin notes preserve the moment when the line between sacred and profane collapsed completely, when the spiritual leader of Western Christianity became indistinguishable from the most excessive rulers of ancient Rome. That is, the lasting significance of this dark episode, not merely as a tale of personal misconduct, but as a stark mirror reflecting the extremes within human nature. The same civilization capable of building cathedrals of breathtaking beauty also produced spectacles that challenged the very foundations of spiritual authority. The chestnuts may have been swept away before dawn, but the questions they raise about power, morality, and the fragility of human virtue continue to echo through history, waiting for each new generation to confront them.